Alice Hen.
And I'm James King. Where are you today, Alice?
Well, this is actually going to amuse you, James. I am Sicily. I just came back from climbing Mount Etna. So talk about dancing on a volcano. And I am in Sicily, and hopefully you can't hear the wailing sirens on the street. It's fairly noisy here.
I'll keep an ear out for them as the podcast goes on.
Thanks, James. Well, in today's episode of China Decode, we are discussing the build-out of AI data centers, how the US and China are taking different approaches, the Chinese Navy's debut of a new aircraft carrier and what that means for tensions in the region, and the dream of flying taxis, it might be closer than you think. All right, James, let's get straight into it. In this great race that's developing increasingly over capable AI tools, both China and the US are building out massive data centers. Generative AI models lean on a massive amount of powerful GPUs, which need both a lot of electricity to perform and a great deal of water to stay cool. So given the high cost and the vast energy implications of these data centers, let's talk a little bit about how these things are getting paid for and getting power in both the Chinese and the American contexts. So, James, I think, now that we've turned the page on the trade conflict and it seems that we're back into a détente period, what struck me over the last week as being quite interesting was the Jensen Huang piece in the FT, where you used to work, in which he says that China is, quote unquote, nanoseconds behind America in the AI race, primarily because electricity generation is so much more abundant in China and a great deal cheaper. And so he, I think, has issued a clarion call within the American context to showcase to Americans that China actually has some tools in its toolkit in this broader AI competition. I would love to get into the minutiae of it in terms of the comparison. But what struck me as interesting is the fact that the US, when you look at CapEx cycle, is clearly orders of magnitude ahead, not only in terms of just raw capex that we've seen by the big tech companies, the big AI frontier labs and the tech companies, but also in the fact that you have, from a policy standpoint, the US Stargate project, which is $500 billion deployed over 4 years. I think the Chinese equivalent Stargate, which was announced by Alibaba this year, is only $53 billion over 3 years. But I think this is going to incite a reaction from China, probably in the next March NPC when the 5-year plan is unveiled, to really, I think, increase the amount of expenditure for data centers. And again, as I alluded to, China is a country that leads in power generation. It basically produces 10,000 terawatts per hour in terms of energy. That's more than double what the US produces. But certainly it has, as we've talked about in previous podcast episodes, a semiconductor disadvantage in the sense that it doesn't have access to the energy efficient, cutting edge, leading edge semiconductors that are produced, for instance, by NVIDIA. But James, what's your take on this AI competition that is ballooning?
Well, as you say, Alice, I think the key point is around these data centers, because it's in data centers, which you wouldn't really look twice at. I mean, they're sort of big square buildings on the side of the road. But it's inside these data centers that the machines that train artificial intelligence models actually work. And so without big data centers, you can't train your AI algorithms to get better and better. So that's the key aspect of why data centers are important. And data centers, as you mentioned, are really power hungry. And they also need a lot of air conditioning and they need a lot of water. And so, the race between the US and China on artificial intelligence, to a large extent, comes down to these data centers. And as you said at the beginning, I think it's really interesting that Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, said this month that he thought that China will win the AI race. Then he slightly backpedaled and said, oh, well, China's only nanoseconds behind. But I think this allows us to really look into the constituent parts of who is likely to win the AI race, because, of course, the stakes are enormous. AI is going to power all kinds of applications. It's going to power all kinds of technologies, and it already is. So the question of who wins is really crucial essential to the technology economy. Now, as you mentioned, Alice, each country has different assets. The first thing to be said is that at the moment, the US is way ahead in terms of the number of data centers it has. The US has got well over 5,000 data centers as things stand. And China, according to statistics that I've been able to find, has only about 450. But this might not stay that way, and we also need to look at the cost structures involved. The remarkable thing about China's data centers is where they're located. They tend to be in the deserts in the far north of China. Some of them are in a desert called the Taklamakan, which actually I've been to. I went through it on a bus. I wish I could say I went on a camel, but on a bus, it took 4 days to cross. And the name of the Taklamakan actually means if you go in, you never come out. And it is one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. The temperature is often nudging 50 degrees Celsius, about 120 degrees Fahrenheit. But the reason it's there, and the reason that China's putting so many of these data centers that power the latest, era of new technology in deserts is because the sun beats down and the power for these data centers is generated by solar panels. And the power that China is generating through these solar panels is actually the cheapest power anywhere in the world. It costs about 2 US cents per kilowatt hour. Just to give you an example, that is about 1/5 of the cheapest cost of electricity generated in the UK through coal. So China's got, this natural advantage in terms of building data centers in the desert. But it also has a couple of other strategies, one of which is big subsidies by the government, subsidies in terms of the energy bills that the data centers have to pay. The government is subsidizing that so that it means that a lot of these data centers in China are paying just half of what you would normally pay for the data centers. And the other big advantage that China has is called super clusters. I won't go into this in great detail, but just suffice it to say that the US is far ahead when it comes to the power of individual computer chips. So the Blackwell chip is far more powerful than anything that China has. But China is perfecting a way of putting lots and lots of its own indigenous chips, mostly made by Huawei, into what's called a supercluster. Some of these superclusters have like 380 chips in them, but China wants to go much, much bigger than that. It wants to have a supercluster of more than 8,000 chips. And so it hopes that it can increase the compute power by using many, many more chips. So I think that's the contours of the competition that we see. What are you hearing, Alice? I mean, do you think China can make it, or do you think the US is just in an unassailable lead?
So the way that I think about this is the debates that I heard a couple of years ago, and which you were also privy to, James, if you recall, during the Biden administration, there were a great amount of export controls on Chinese chips, or rather Chinese imports of chips coming out of America and elsewhere. And the consensus at the time was that China is screwed. China will not be able to find an option. AI will severely be impaired in terms of its development in China as a result of this hardware constraint. That consensus has shifted a great deal, and I sense that the consensus around AI has also shifted in the sense that people no longer think that China is down and out. China has, as you allude to and reference, James, its own distinct advantages and disadvantages. But the way that I think about the future is that whereas a lot of the, I would say, post-World War II era was about bytes, a lot of the internet revolution was about bytes. I think in some respects we're returning to the world of atoms of much of the 19th and 20th century, if you recall. And China has been very good at indigenizing and securitizing its energy supply chains. As I referenced, it is the world's biggest producer of electricity, and it has even more projects that it's going to bring online, like the hydroelectric dam in Tibet, which could put even more energy on the grid. I think that this is something that people are starting to realize is an important aspect, this energy aspect in the AI competition. It's not just about chips. It's not just about, the trillions of capex that the US seems to be dedicating currently and over the next few years in terms of capex outlays for AI data centers. It's also about energy production and energy efficiency. So on the production front, China is leading in energy. On the efficiency front, as you allude to, James, there's interesting ways in which they can cluster. But I was reading also that Alibaba, so even the tech companies themselves, when they design their LLMs, which we could get into, they are designing more energy efficient LLMs that in theory could lead to an 82% drop in the number of NVIDIA GPUs that they would require to basically power the AI models. And so just to give people a sense of the numbers, that's what would normally take 1,192 GPUs. Apparently, the researchers at Alibaba are able to do with just 213 NVIDIA H20 GPUs. That's the difference between spending $2.5 million on NVIDIA GPUs and spending way over $14 million. And again, if you think about it from an energy perspective, the power savings could also be massive as well. So I think there's an interesting thing that's happening on the energy production front and the energy efficiency front that I think people are starting to cotton on to. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of got to bring it back to why Jensen Huang is saying that China will win. And I think a lot of the reasons are the ones you just cited, plus the fact that China has gone for an open source model in all of these large language models that it's coming out with. So as of October, 9 of the 10 top open source artificial intelligence models are Chinese. This is in contrast to many of the American models, such as OpenAI's ChatGPT, which is not open source. So China's going really quite a different route from the US. China's going cheap power, superclusters of semiconductors, fewer data centers, but probably cheaper to build, and then trying to make the artificial intelligence models that it brings out open source so that a lot of companies in China can then start to build their applications based on those models and start to make money by deploying AI in the economy. I think that's China's approach. It still doesn't quite explain to me why Jensen Huang would say that he thinks China will win. Because if you look at the US, they've got better chips, far more powerful chips, and they've got many more data centers to train the AI models. So I don't know. I don't know which side of this I come down on, actually, tell you the truth, Alice. I think the US is a formidable competitor.
Yeah, I still think I agree. It's too early to tell. And as we've been saying in previous podcasts, China's going to do AI with Chinese characteristics. No doubt about it. It's going to do it in a way that's quite different from the US. And as we were talking about in previous episodes, the US is chasing AGI, areas that might be more compute intensive, whereas China is not just making energy cheap in the support of AI models, rather, but it's also making models cheap. I mean, I was looking at some of the numbers. The DeepSeek chat model, the cost per million output tokens is only $1.10. Q1 Plus from Alibaba, it's $1.20. And for reference, GPT-5 from OpenAI, it's $10. Claude Sonnet from Anthropic, 4.5 is $15. So they are making these LLMs cheap along with energy. And I think with massive implications when we think about the AI competition. In many ways, they are competing for different one that it designed and built all by itself. This comes a short time after Chinese President Xi Jinping's massive military parade in September for the 80th anniversary, which drew a lot of attention on how recent advancements in homegrown Chinese hardware have raised the capabilities of China's military, inching closer to parity with the US. James, you're more of an expert in this area, so I really want to stop and listen to what you have to say. But I was actually in Beijing during the week of the military parade. And what was interesting, not only was the patriotism around it, but the fact that China really was, so to speak, bringing out the big guns. It was showing a new nuclear triad in terms of equipment, military drones, new ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, you name it. But it was very clear to me watching this that this was a big sign to Washington and the region that China had key deterrence capabilities when it comes to its military hardware and equipment. James, you're very close to this. How big of a deal is this Fujian carrier, and what does it mean for China's broader military goals?
I think it's a big deal because it helps us to kind of understand the military balance between the US and China. There's no question that China is catching up the US. This is part of a bigger topic of the geopolitics between the two superpowers, and it particularly relates to potential theaters of warfare. I use the word potential underlined and stressed because I'm not predicting any kind of a conflagration between the US and China, but let's say around Taiwan, also the South China Sea, and there are other areas where the US and China kind of contest each other already in a geopolitical sense. So the emergence of China's third aircraft carrier, which, as you mentioned, was designed and built entirely by China, that is important. The big picture for China is that China wants to build what it calls a modernized military force by 2035. So that's 10 years from now. And it wants to build what it calls a world-class military force by 2050. And what people understand by the words world-class means that by that time, it hopes to be able to take on the US if it needs to. As things stand, purely in terms of aircraft carriers, China is a long way behind the US. Now that China has 3 aircraft carriers, the US has 11. So China has the second largest number of aircraft carriers of any country in the world, but clearly it's still far behind. And I think it's true to say that the technology of the US carriers is far superior to those in China. For instance, the US carriers are nuclear powered, whereas the Chinese carriers at the moment all run on diesel. And of course, nuclear power is much more self-sustaining than diesel. However, when we look at other aspects of the military balance, China is already a formidable competitor. The Chinese Navy is now far larger than that of the US. They're projected to have about 50% more ships than the US by 2030. So already, I think we can't sort of underestimate what China can do in terms of military projection. Just coming back to this aircraft carrier itself, I mean, it's absolutely enormous. It's more than 300 meters long. I mean, the scale of these things is just incredible. That means it can carry about 60 aircraft, and it cost well over $6 billion to make. So, it's a pretty amazing thing, I must say. What did you think when you saw pictures of this carrier, Alice?
Well, firstly, I mean, they definitely were putting their best foot forward. Everything that came out on the parade on TV that I saw and subsequently in the images was extremely, extremely impressive. But at the end of the day, these images are Potemkin villages in a way. They're not battle tested and battle ready. And that, I think, has been the enduring concern about the PLA's capabilities. It's one thing to have cutting edge equipment and to, narrow parity with the US, but it's another thing to have the battle experience that, say, Russia is having in Ukraine. And I think that, again, going back to previous discussions we've had, one of the big concerns for Xi Jinping, especially after the Russia-Ukraine conflict emerged, is whether or not the PLA has the ability and battle readiness to take a stance on Taiwan, to either launch an amphibious assault or salami slice it through a quarantine and blockade. And I'm not so sure, and people have different views on whether or not these military equipment are designed to deter the US from aggression in the Asia-Pacific or to help launch Xi Jinping's ambitions when it comes to a reunification, what he would call a reunification of China, basically taking Taiwan into the fold. When I think about this, I think a lot about both capabilities and intentions. And it's not clear to me, especially after the military purges that we saw at the fourth plenum, whether or not Xi Jinping feels that he is ready for prime time when it comes to using these carriers for a Taiwan showdown. But what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, this is the whole question of Taiwan and whether or not China would make a move to try to retake Taiwan is one of those things that China experts spend a long time thinking about and talking about. And, everybody has their own opinion. There really is no evidence. That's why you find such a diversity of opinion among people of our trade, Alice. But my own take on this is that China wants to build up a military that is so forbiddingly huge that the US would think twice or think more than twice about ever taking China on in any kind of a military theater. And my sense on Taiwan particularly is that China would very much like to reabsorb Taiwan without fighting. It knows that if it was to launch a military adventure against Taiwan, there would be catastrophic consequences for the global economy, and that would include China. So I think its aim is probably to build up its military force by showing off new hardware, such as this huge new aircraft carrier, such as the military parade in Beijing that you mentioned just a minute ago, and then hope that everybody is kind of cowed and overawed, and Taiwan meekly returns to the motherland at some point in the future. That's my sort of summary of what I think China's aiming at.
Well, when you were talking, I was thinking of two things. The first is the fact that China, as you mentioned, this aircraft carrier is run on diesel, not nuclear. The US is still at the state of supremacy when it comes to nuclear-powered submarines and operational nuclear warheads. The figure is quite stunning. China has 600 operational nuclear warheads, and you compare to that US with well over 5,000. The US is leading. In fact, I think the second largest stockpile is held by Russia. That gives you a sense of how much China needs to do to catch up. It's projected they'll reach 1,000 warheads, China, by 2030. Its stockpile of ICBMs, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, is roughly on parity with the US's. But there are certain key areas, and I've heard from military experts in the realm of submarine technology, especially where China is quite a great degree behind the US. But the second point I wanted to make, and to quote my boss and mentor Neil Ferguson, he has this law called Ferguson's Law, in which any country that spends more on debt servicing rather than the military throughout history has been on a downturn trajectory. It loses its superpower status. And the US hit that threshold a few years ago. I think that is quite material when we think about the superpower struggle between China and the US. China is increasing its military spending, massively ramping up its military arsenal at a time when the US is doing it in the opposite direction. That's, I think, quite material when we think about the future of US-China in the region.
Oh, that's great. I hadn't heard of Ferguson's Law before. I really like that. I guess the problem with China is, though, that China keeps its military spending deeply secret. I mean, it does come out with figures, yes, but nobody trusts them. So we don't really know whether China is spending more or less on debt servicing than on its military. But that's a great metric. I really like that. Yeah.
It's a fair point. And we'll have to see in the March NPC what they say is because every year in the March NPC and the government work report, as you know, they will issue a statement about how much they want to increase military spending by. But to your point, James, there's so much of this is smoke and mirrors. We don't know what is actually being spent and where it's being spent. And I think Ukraine is a great example of the fact that money isn't everything. You've got to be able to tactically deploy it well and spend it on the right things and use, for instance, drones in an operational manner. The Ukrainians have been very lean but very successful. So that's sized flying vessel. Then much of the 21st century must have been very, very disappointing to you as flying cars. I mean, I watched Back to the Future. I don't know if you have, James, but they have proved still very much elusive. That is until now, perhaps. The company Yihang, based in Guangzhou, China, says it has developed a flying air taxi. It is battery-powered and completely autonomous. It flies without a pilot inside. Yihang says it plans to deploy these unmanned eVTOLs, that stands for Electric Vertical Takeoff and Landing, between airports and some cities in China within 3 years. And they say that flights will be offered cheap, only 200 to 300 yuan, or about the equivalent of 30 to 40 US dollars. James, is this for real or is it all hype?
Well, it's definitely for real. I've been following these guys for a few years, actually, but I must say, Alice, when it comes to this kind of thing, I'm personally a complete wimp. You know, I have a friend, for instance, who has a helicopter. He's been badgering me for years to get into it, and I've only ever caved in once. I'm kind of terrified by these things personally, but I'm really interested in EHang and EVTOL. It sort of looks a bit like a doodle bug. You know, it's got a small cabin, enough room for maybe 2 people. And then it's got these drone-like rotor blades that sort of spin round. And the really scary aspect of these EVTOLs is that they're autonomously driven. So there is no pilot. So you're sitting there and you're completely at the mercy of the AI algorithm that takes you from A to B. And I must say, I would find that very scary indeed. I have been in autonomously driven cars. I was in one in Shenzhen last year. I was slightly nervous about that, but it was totally fine. Getting into an oversized drone and sitting in it and trusting this thing to take you from A to B without crashing, to me is a totally different kettle of fish. But as you say, this has got a license now from the Chinese authorities, and they reckon that they're going to be working commercially within about 3 years. And given that these types of projections in China are always padded out, they normally happen quicker than is projected. I reckon, you know, we could be seeing these vehicles in use a couple of years from now, maybe in certain areas, you know, not in general use, but in certain areas. And I'm very interested to read that Morgan Stanley, the investment bank, reckons that the market for these vehicles, these EVTOLs, could reach about $1 trillion by 2040 and even 9 trillion by 2050. So obviously Morgan Stanley's impressed. They reckon that this is going to become a big part of the way we get around. So maybe it will happen. The last thing I'd say is that China's clearly imbibed this. They've clearly decided that this is going to be something that the future revolves around. And they've come up with a name for this type of technology. They call it the low altitude economy. So maybe the low altitude economy is going to be a big deal.
Yeah, I when I first saw the image of this, I just thought this looks like a giant version of a drone. And something that I'd imagine Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible to sit into. Hopefully that it doesn't get tapped into by an enemy agent. But it seems very futuristic. And it points to the fact that I think people in China are so ready for tech adoption. They're, I think, a lot more daring when it comes to these newfangled technologies. My, I guess, concern would be as you go into different airspaces, what are going to be the rules of the road and how are you going to regulate this? I think the government is happy for this to be another way in which Chinese manufacturing capacity can be exported to the rest of the world in the future. But I think the technology is moving, as often is the case, much more quickly than the regulation can keep up or even regulators can conceive of regulating it. So it's not clear to me how Chinese local government or the central government will think about regulating this space when it really becomes viable. But I was reading that one of these taxi vehicles that EHang is rolling out can fly over 100 miles on a single charge. And it's taken a cumulative 40,000 flights in 19 countries to date. So it seems that viable for now, but it's going to be interesting to see how this unveils in China as, you know, adoption becomes more widespread. But I haven't seen anything, I don't know if you have, James, in the US context that's comparable. I don't think they have truly autonomous non-flying cars. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, this is what I was just about to say. I spent a bit of time Googling various countries in Europe and the US to see whether or not they've got a licensing process for these EVTOLs, and I couldn't find any. The fact, as you mentioned, that EHang has had flights in 19 different countries to date suggests to me that they're trying to convince the authorities, no doubt in Europe and the US and elsewhere, that this is a viable technology, that these flying vehicles are not just going to drop from the sky. And so maybe they will prevail in certain areas, and maybe they'll be licensed in other countries as well. I guess it's all a matter of safety, really. If EHang can prove that these are safe, then, well, why not,
Yeah, this is definitely going to change the way that we move around. I wonder what the first use cases will be, if it's people doing this for fun, or if they're actually using it to commute, or if they're using it to send packages. I think it'll be really interesting to see how they quickly commercialize this, and so definitely watch this space. But at least I think they should change the name, because it's a mouthful, EVTOL, as an acronym. So we're going to have to find a different one.
You're definitely right there.
Okay, James, it is prediction time. One of my favorite parts of this episode. What's your prediction for the future as you look into your crystal ball?
Okay, well, I'm going to stay with the low altitude economy. I'm not talking about these flying taxis. I'm talking now about drones. Because the other thing that's happening in China in the low altitude economy is that the drone delivery market is really taking off, excuse the pun. And it looks like this year, maybe there could be more than 5 million packages delivered by drones in China. That would be up from 2.7 million packages delivered last year. And the important thing about this is that, as I'm sure you're aware, Alice, the key thing about delivering packages is that it's quite costly in what they call the last mile. So, the last stage of the delivery process, where the delivery person has to find your house and then post your package through your letterbox, or if you're not there or you don't have a letterbox, do something else. That's the costly bit of delivery. So having a drone that can literally come to your front door and just drop the package, on your doorstep is going to be a lot cheaper. And that's why we're seeing such a big uptick in the drone delivery market in China. So my prediction is 5 million packages delivered this year in China by drone.
Yeah, it sounds like, James, as you talk, we're going to have a lot of drone overcapacity. There's going to be drones everywhere. So, James, my prediction is more left field, and it's centered in France, where the French fraud watchdog has suspended Shein from operating in France. Now, Shein, as many will recall, we discussed in previous episodes, is China's fast fashion retailer platform. And apparently it seems that on the Shein platform, there were illegal sales of these sex dolls that resembled children. These listings have been taken off of Shein, and Shein has confirmed this. But I think this is symptomatic of a larger issue that is rising between the EU and China, which centers around trade and technology. Whereas in previous episodes, we discussed a great deal of tension between Washington and Beijing. I think what we are starting to see is more storm clouds emerging between Brussels and China. My own sense in talking to people from Europe is that they were very unhappy with the way in which China basically used the rare earths export controls, even though China has since walked that back. And I think that move engendered a great deal of mistrust from the policymakers in Europe. So my sense is that there's going to be more investigations in the next few months on Chinese goods, not just the ones that they've listed, for instance, on Chinese tires. And there may be more, I think, sanctions on Chinese companies in Europe, in addition to what we're seeing with Nexperia, for instance, the Chinese semiconductor company based in the Netherlands. This, I think, is a tide that is ultimately symptomatic of worsening trade relations between Europe and China.
A very interesting call. I have a hunch that you're right about that. I think the Europe may well get a bit tougher.
All right, that's all for this episode. Thank you so much for listening to China Decode. This is a production of Prof G Media. Make sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss an episode. Talk to you again.
Details aren't yet confirmed. It is reported that the EU has agreed to pay a 15% tariff rate on most goods. Europe also agreed to increase their investment level in the US by more than $600 billion. This framework follows the July 11th letter from Trump, which threatened a 30% tariff rate on EU goods unless a deal could be struck by August 1st. On the news, the markets were mostly unaffected. The S&P finished the day about 0.2% higher. The Nasdaq closed up more than 0.3%. The Euro Stoxx 600, an index of leading European blue-chip companies, that ended the day down a little over 0.2%. So, Trump has completed a deal with the EU. This one, according to the president, is, quote, the biggest deal ever reached in any capacity. This comes less than a week after Trump made a deal with Japan, which was, in his words, quote, the largest deal ever made. So both of them record-breaking deals. This deal's even bigger than the last one. Truly historic. I say that sarcastically, but I should add that actually a lot of people do believe it. Many people online and in the media are viewing this deal as a crucial victory, as evidence that the Trump strategy is working, that he's getting deals done, that he is winning. And it's not just Jesse Waters or people on Fox, it's more than that. Here's a Bloomberg opinion headline from yesterday, quote, Europeans, not Trump, ended up chickening out. Here's another one, quote, Trump wins the Hulkamania tariffs brawl he started. Here's a tweet from a mainstream financial journalist, quote, Trump is winning on trade. So many people are calling this deal a win for Trump, and you can kind of see why. He threatened these tariffs, and in return, he got this commitment from the EU to invest $600 billion into the US. Sounds pretty good, but it also sounds very similar to the deal we saw with Japan last week, which was a reduction in tariffs and in return, a commitment to invest $550 billion into the US. And so considering this is essentially the same thing, I will ask essentially the same questions I asked last week, which are, what are they investing in? What are the terms of the investment? What is the timeline? And has anything been signed? And as with last week, the answers this week are the same. For the first three questions, the answer is we don't know. And for the final question, the answer is no. Nothing has been signed. This is once again a framework of a deal, meaning that everything Trump is saying, literally all of it, is subject to change. And as we discussed last week, this is a recurring theme in Trump land that, by the way, has consistently never worked. Whether it was the $200 billion commitment from China, which never actually materialized, or the $600 billion investment plan that was $1 trillion and then $300 billion and then $600 billion from Saudi Arabia hasn't materialized, or the $500 billion from Apple, or the $500 billion from OpenAI and SoftBank. Over and over again, we see an announcement of a deal, a big headline, and then 6 months later we look back and we realize, actually, no, nothing ever happened, nothing was signed, nothing changed. And thus, no deal got done. This is the reality of Trump's deal-making. And what is most ironic about this is the fact that in the same week that we learn of this historic trade deal with the EU, we also learn some new information about the historic trade deal with Japan. The trade deal that was supposed to have Japan invest more than $500 billion into America, and that America was supposed to receive 90% of the profits on. That was the deal, which, by the way, we said would never materialize. Well, we now have some clarification on that deal from the Japanese government. This came out over the weekend. According to Japan's chief negotiator, of that $550 billion, only 1% of it will actually be invested in America. The remaining 99% are going to take place in the form of a loan, which the Japanese government is going to collect interest on. So put another way, no, Japan isn't investing $550 billion. They're investing $5 billion. And by the way, the timeline has been clarified to 3.5 years, which means that Japan's annual investment into the US is going to come out to $1.5 billion. That is 26 times less than the amount of money OpenAI just raised in a private venture round. So, as predicted, the Japan deal was not a deal. The only thing we got wrong about that one was that the truth came out way quicker than we anticipated. And here we are all over again with Europe. a $600 billion commitment with no deal terms, no timeline, and no signatures. Now, people might say, what about the $750 billion they say they're going to spend on energy? To which I would say, once again, not a deal. Nothing's been signed. And in addition, Europe was already going to buy that energy because of this very widely understood concept called the Ukraine war. So as has been proven with Japan, this is, once again, not a deal. This is a press release. This is Europe saying something to make Donald Trump appear victorious and therefore make him happy. We know that's basically all he cares about. So let's go back to our deal tracker. And just to remind you of what our definition of what a deal is, our definition is a contract or a treaty that is signed and ratified into law. That's what we think a deal is. This doesn't meet that definition. So today is July 29th. We're about 190 days and probably 50 tariff announcements into this presidential administration, and we are currently sitting on a grand total of 0 deals. That's where we're at. Let's give Scott a call. I'm sure he has many reactions of his own. Scott, how's it going?
It's going really well, Ed. How about you?
I'm doing well. I see you're in New York.
I am in New York. That's right. You recognize my apartment, don't you?
I recognize your background. I recognize your Grayson Perry on the wall.
That's right. That's right. My only piece of art, Ed. One piece of art.
It's a good one.
Right.
Well, we want to get your take on this EU trade deal, a historic deal, apparently the biggest deal ever reached in any capacity. Those are the president's words. Your reaction, Scott?
I'm curious what your thoughts are. Based on what I've read, this is a good deal for the U.S. and a bad deal for the EU. And that is, it looks like it's asymmetrically advantaged to us in terms of tariffs. They're mostly opening their markets, keeping their markets the same or opening them further. And I was trying to figure out how we ended up in a place with a better deal than them, other than obviously the genius deal making of the president. And I think it's a couple things. One, I think this is where it really hurts to have 27 member countries, that Europe is not really a union. And two, I think the elephant in the room, and Mia pointed this out, is the US military umbrella. That the real existential threat of getting into a trade war with the United States is it diminishes their ability to push back on the Russian army in Ukraine. And that also, I think that for the first time, America potentially leaving NATO and folding or collapsing the military umbrella that the EU has enjoyed is a real possibility. So I think for just market stability, to get their businesses back to planning again, to try and, I would imagine part of this was a wink and a nod that America will continue to support the Ukrainian army and also be a productive member or the base anchor of NATO, that they needed to get this deal done. The net, as far as I can tell, if this framework becomes an actual tariff deal, is it'll raise prices on U.S. households about $2,400. It's interesting, I guess our primary import from Europe is, I assumed it was Hermes scarves. It's not, it's pharmaceuticals. So our prices do go up, but this is just calling balls and strikes the way I see it, and I do want your opinion here. I feel like this is a win for Trump, that he got the better end of this deal as far as I read it. What are your thoughts, Ed?
Well, I think a lot of people are saying that. And I got to be honest, I can't see any reason why. I mean, this is the same thing we've seen before. We're putting up a tariff. And as we all know, that tariff is a tax on us.
Yeah.
Yes, it's going to lower demand on Europe's side of things. But ultimately, who are we taxing? We're taxing the people who import those products to America.
Yeah.
We're taxing American companies. So that's America losing on that side. There's also America losing in terms of prices going up. And then again, we got to get to the quid pro quo here. What did we get in return? Well, Europe's supposedly investing $600 billion in America. But if history's any guide, we've seen it with Japan and with China and Saudi Arabia. It means absolutely nothing. Yeah. And nothing's actually been signed here. And so I don't fully understand why people have decided to wake up this morning and say, oh, this one's legit. This one makes sense. This one's a win. It's a victory. Even the markets, I mean, perhaps they're gleaning that information from the market's reaction, but the market's reaction was very, very small. S&P closed maybe 0.2% higher. That's basically flat these days. European market down 0.2%. I mean, in my view, that's not much of a reaction. So the way I see it, again, nothing's changed, and we've gone over that. But I guess I would be interested in why your thoughts on why people might be seeing this as something more substantial than anything we've seen before. Perhaps because it's with the European Union and the tensions have been higher. I mean, what is it you think about this deal that people decided to say, okay, this one's a win. Japan was kind of a tie, but this one's a win for Trump.
This does feel a little bit, Ed, that one or two things happened. Either the EU said, we're just going to play slow ball, agree to a framework. We need to get back to business. The chill here, the indecision is bad for everybody. And we'll work out the details and maybe throw up arms in frustration and never get to a deal, waiting for a Democratic Congress. Or we got to placate this guy because we need arms to continue to flow into Ukraine. Otherwise, is Poland next? So it feels to me like the US, based on the framework I've saw, has got the better end of this deal. I would have thought the EU would have responded with equivalent reciprocal tariffs. And it doesn't look like that. It looks like our tariffs that we're managed at getting them, at least in terms of a framework to agree to, are greater than the tariffs that are going to be imposed on us.
Well, perhaps Europe has realized that tariffs are a tax on themselves. I mean, this is another big piece of it.
You sound like literally the physical embodiment of The Economist magazine. The Economist is saying The Economist magazine has been saying for 40 years, the reason for Beijing, the reason that the kind of center of gravity for The Economist is that free trade and free markets are the way to go. And I think you make a really solid argument. As a matter of fact, when I first saw this, I thought, oh, we're lowering tariffs on everyone. This is actually a free trade agreement. And I agree with you. But this is where we are. It felt like we're on the precipice of a trade war where we were going to implement 50%. He was threatening 30 and 50% taxes. I thought they would have reciprocated with those taxes. And then we see economic growth just come to a standstill. And then the largest democracies in the world figure out a way to create openings for autocracies. So this whole framework, all of this bullshit, this nonsense probably should have never happened, right? Mm-hmm. And the really interesting analysis to your point will be, okay, who are the winners and losers versus a year ago? And I'm not sure we're going to come out with much different other than a huge erosion and goodwill towards us. Having said that, it's back to business. It does feel like the tariffs are a bit asymmetrically favored towards us. And I'd like to think, and I don't know if this was the case, I'd like to think that Trump said, give me a win here, give me a great press release, and I'll continue to ship arms into Ukraine and bear hug and talk about how much I love NATO. I don't know if that happened, but that is a big playing card. But the first thing I thought of is that Europe is a union in name only. That when you have the Prime Minister of France coming out and saying this is a terrible day, they can't even speak with one voice. And so it's not easy to have 27 member nations, all with veto power, trying to negotiate a deal like this. So net, given where we are, given a trade war that made no sense to begin with, I call this a lowercase win for the Trump administration. Even if it's a perceptual win here, Ed, I do think when you read this press release and 27, EU member nations or whatever it is have signed up to this framework, I think the Trump administration can legitimately say this was a win for them. Let me put it this way. I think, the perception is the reality right now. And the perception is that our largest trading partner in the world has come to an agreement for a framework that on the face of it looks like it's asymmetrically tilted towards the US. We'll see what happens here.
Yeah, we'll see. I don't think it is, but we will see.
That's our little economist, our little economist subscriber. He's not having any of it. It's those geniuses in Brussels with their fondue.
I'll believe it when I see a deal. I'll believe it when I see a deal that is signed and sealed, that's ratified. That's when I'll start to believe any of this. But I'm not buying into these press releases. We've seen them too many times. Nike's price target predicting a share price of $93 by December of 2026. The bank also increased the outlook for the company's earnings per share in both fiscal years 2026 and 2027. And JP Morgan isn't alone. Goldman Sachs, Jefferies, and Argus have also upgraded the stock in recent weeks. Nike shares rose 3% on yesterday's news, and the stock is now trading at its highest level in 5 months. So this has been a pretty great week for Nike, a pretty great month for Nike. And it's coming at a time when things have been, generally speaking, quite bad for the company. The stock fell 30% last year. Revenue fell nearly 10%. Net profit fell nearly 50%. We also had this tariff drama, which is a big problem for a company that builds most of its products in China. They also had this management shakeup recently, which forced them to withdraw their guidance in a recent earnings report. That was a problem. They've had too much inventory. They've had weak demand, bad forecasting. We could go on forever. Things have not looked good for Nike. But it appears that something is beginning to change. Perhaps it's the new CEO, Elliott Hill. Perhaps it's market conditions. We're not exactly sure. But analysts on Wall Street are starting to take notice. So to understand what exactly is going on at Nike, our producer Claire spoke with Lorraine Hutchinson, a retail analyst at Bank of America.
I think the biggest thing that's changed with Nike is we have a line of sight that the worst is behind us. So they've had a lot of struggles with putting out product that's way too lifestyle focused. And they oversold a lot of these key franchises rather than innovating and launching new franchises. They had to clean that up under a new management team, and that's been really harmful to the sales and the earnings of the company. So now we've started to see some green shoots and signs that the worst of that is behind us. And I think that's caused investors to focus more on what could earnings look like as they come out of this really tough time.
Would you say the stock has bottomed in that case?
I think it has. We have a buy on the stock. We think the stock goes higher from here based on continued sequential trajectory in the sales and the margins.
What would you say Elliott Hill, the CEO, is doing right?
So Elliott Hill joined and diagnosed the problem very quickly. He looked and saw these 3 lifestyle styles as being much too high a percentage of total sales. And so he realized as the sell-through began to slow that Nike needed to exit a lot of that volume very quickly. They had started this before he took over as CEO, but they accelerated it dramatically. So what does that mean? It means clearing through some of the liable product that's already on the shelves. It means buying back some product from wholesale. It means really trying to clean up the inventory out of the wholesale channel and out of Nike's retail stores. That was really the first thing he did. He also reorganized the company back to focusing on sport instead of gender or product. It's now sport. So they're really very laser focused on their heritage of being a performance company. And that's been a big cultural change for Nike.
That was Lorraine Hutchinson, retail analyst at Bank of America. Well, it'll be very interesting to see how this Nike story unfolds. As we've said, the past few years have been incredibly rough. Back in 2021, the stock was at an all-time high. The company was worth nearly $300 billion. Since then, the stock's been more than cut in half. We're looking at a market cap right now of less than $120 billion. And a lot of that failure was blamed on the former CEO, John Donahoe, who tried to lead this digital transformation of Nike, investing in tech and e-commerce and even crypto, even NFTs, which kind of seemed exciting at the time. But ultimately, it came at the expense of the things that make Nike, Nike, things like brand, product quality, wholesale partnerships, etc. So when John Donahoe stepped down as CEO and Elliott Hill, the former Nike exec, took over, the idea was that Elliott would bring the company back to its roots, that he would focus on the things that made Nike great. And that was a big piece of why Scott became bullish on Nike back in October of last year. This was part of Scott's fallen angel thesis, this idea that these once iconic companies, not just Nike, but also Intel, Disney, Estee Lauder, that those companies whose stocks had gotten battered in recent years would rediscover their roots and return to a valuation that more accurately reflected their iconic status in American culture, which as of the beginning of this year, they say is more than double its $61.5 billion valuation from earlier this year, and it would make it the third most valuable startup in the world. This comes as the company's annual recurring revenue has quadrupled to $4 billion since the beginning of the year, fueled by enterprise subscriptions and its coding assistant, Claude Code. Now, the startup world is understandably very excited about this valuation, about what it says about Anthropic, and also what it says about the future of AI in general. And that is totally fair, and we agree. However, the more interesting story here isn't the jump in valuation. The more interesting story here is who's investing. According to the Financial Times, Anthropic has been holding talks with MGX, which is the government-owned investment fund of the United Arab Emirates, which on its face isn't that interesting. Everyone's raising money in the Gulf these days. But it is more interesting when you realize that as of last year, Anthropic made it a point that they would never raise money from the Middle East. According to the CEO, quote, "Democracies need to be able to set the terms by which powerful AI is brought into the world, both to avoid being overpowered by authoritarians and to prevent human rights abuses within authoritarian countries." Which is why, last year, Anthropic specifically told its bankers that it would never raise money from Saudi Arabia. It's also why Dario Amodei, the CEO, was the one notably absent AI leader during Trump's trip to the Middle East in the spring. And it is also why he wrote a memo to employees explaining why it is dangerous for AI companies to, quote, "get in bed with the Middle East." In that same memo, he wrote, quote, "The basis of our opposition to large training clusters in the Middle East is that the supply chain of AI is dangerous to hand to authoritarian governments." Fair enough. I'm sure many would agree with him. However, here we are in July, and Anthropic is in talks to raise money from the government of the UAE, a total reversal of what was supposedly an ethical principle of the company. In an attempt to justify this about-face, Dario, the CEO, wrote, quote, "It's perfectly consistent to advocate for a policy of no one is allowed to do X, but then if that policy fails and everyone else does X, to reluctantly do X ourselves." In other words, he's saying, we commit to not taking money from dictators unless, of course, the dictator shows up with a ton of money and other people start taking his money too. Then we'll reevaluate our commitment. So this is becoming a recurring theme on this show. As we discussed a couple weeks ago, Silicon Valley has this tendency to make these bold, ethical declarations and then to abandon them as soon as it gets in the way of making money. We saw it with OpenAI, which was supposed to be a non-profit to benefit humanity, and then they reversed course on that. We saw it with Google, which said it would never work on weapons, and then it just took up a $200 million contract with the Department of Defense. We saw it with Meta, which made the same promises, and then it started working on military products with Anduril. Over and over and over again, these tech companies create mission statements and ethical guidelines and humanitarian promises, and to a near certainty, they never follow through. So this is just another example of that principle. This isn't really an investment thesis. This isn't something you can trade on. It's just something to remember. You can never trust a mission statement. They're almost always empty, especially the ones that come from Silicon Valley. The real
on the team who is deeply introverted and awkward, and I'm not saying you're awkward, but it sounds like you're an introvert. And that's why the majority of successful companies are founded by not one, but several people. So my first company that I started in my second year of business school was a company called Prof, which was a brand strategy firm still around. And my partner was a guy named Ian Chaplin, and Ian was a real, I think of myself as introverted in the sense that I have the skills to be social, especially if there's alcohol around. I'm even sometimes kind of likable or sort of amusing. What? I amuse you? Anyways, great line from Goodfellas. But I can do that. I can work a room. I can get clients. I can do it. It takes energy from me. And that's the definition of an introvert. It's not somebody who's not social, but someone who people sort of take energy from them instead of adding energy to them. And an extrovert is someone who gets energy from people. Anyways, Ian was a very much an introvert, but he was very strong with technology and operations and had all the skills I don't have. And so typically the most successful businesses are one where you have an alchemy of talents. No one person brings it all. And so if you bring product management skills, especially in AI. My brother, you bring a lot to a team. You're actually the secret sauce. Whenever I've been in pitches to a VC firm or oftentimes I get asked to sit in on pitches. The VC will say, all right, who's the tech guy or gal here? Who's the secret sauce? And then they ask them a lot of questions. So it sounds like you need a front man or a front woman who understands, is more comfortable pressing the flesh and trying to raise capital. And you need that person to hire. You need that person for clients. And I keep saying this, agency and the greatness of others. Yeah, start a business, but just find a partner. And I have generally found I've started almost every business I've started with a partner or a core group of people. So again, 1 + 1 = 3 here, my brother. You bring a lot to the table. You just need to find.
I grew up in a low-income, single-parent household and worked hard to make it to a top university on financial aid. Now, I'm surrounded by people from very wealthy backgrounds. Some of my close friends, and now my new girlfriend, come from ultra-privileged families. I find myself feeling uneasy and hyper-aware about this class difference. I can't tell if it's envy, insecurity, or something else, but it's starting to eat away at me. Why do I feel like this? How do I manage this discomfort and stay grounded without letting resentment or self-pity creep in?
It's a question for a licensed therapist, because if this feels like there's some sort of, I don't know, insecurity or trauma or blockage that you need to work through, but that's not going to stop me from talking about me as a means of giving you advice. But I do think it sounds like you could benefit from therapy to kind of explore this issue. I share the same sentiment as you. I don't like rich kids. I have a bias against them. And I don't know if it's because I'm jealous or it's deferred anger from not having money. And that is, I think people who have money or grew up with money they can sympathize with people that don't have money, but they can't really empathize. I just don't think people, and the story I tell is when I didn't get into UCLA, I'm like, I'm not going to college because I needed to live at home. I couldn't afford to go somewhere else. And as I've said several times, I ended up getting in on appeal. But I remember I lived in a wealthy neighborhood. We had kind of the shittiest condo on the block. My mom's boyfriend, who happened to have another family, bought it for us, but it's another story. But I was around a lot of kids, and I was happening when I went to UCLA. I was broke. There was me and one other kid out of 120 of us that everybody knew had no money. We were always late on our fraternity bills. You always feel like there's a ghost whispering in your ear that you're not worthy. I felt like a ghost was following me and my mom around saying, oh, you fucked up. You guys don't have money. You're not worthy. And it just kind of erodes your self-esteem, and you're not as confident. You're not as inclined to take big swings or risks. At least I didn't. And I remember being at a friend's house, and I was all bummed. I hadn't gone to UCLA, and the dad said, well, just get on a plane and fly out to Michigan or Indiana and show up and don't take no for an answer and speak to the admissions department. And this big rah-rah speech, like, get up. And okay, I didn't have a fucking credit card. I had maybe been on a plane a half a dozen times in my life. I wasn't going to get on a plane and go to fucking Michigan to Ann Arbor and just show up. I find that I resent rich kids because I just don't think there's any goddamn way. And by the way, a lot of them are just lovely and very nice. I just don't think there's any way they have any fucking idea about how hard it is to make money and make something of yourself when you don't come from money. If a university's mission is to create income mobility, like the most important university in New York is not Columbia or NYU, it's PACE, because it takes people who maybe didn't get tutors and all sorts of special time. That's my favorite now in these schools, is that every rich parent is convincing or writing a letter saying their kid has some acronym and that they need extra time. Back to you. Your resentment, I think, is understandable. I have figured out that, okay, enough already. Or I try to be more generous and graceful and realize, like, good for them. They were born with money. Wasn't their fault. To the benefit or the drawback doesn't mean they're not really good people. But I do find I resent them. I think it's because I'm a little bit jealous and insecure about my upbringing. But if you're really having trouble and it's kind of getting to you and sort of getting in the way or really eroding your confidence, I would suggest there's something deeper going on and suggest that you reach out to a licensed therapist. There's now a bunch of great online platforms, and talk through this issue with a licensed professional to try and, it feels like there might be something deeper here and that it's just
focused on consulting for landscaping businesses across Canada and the US. I've been thinking a lot lately about your advice on the importance, particularly in the early growth stages of a company, of hiring and retaining great people and then getting out of their way. We recently hit a key milestone for our business of a profitable 1 million in annual recurring revenue. And in order to continue to scale, I know this is going to be critical to get right. You often say that if you want people to act like owners, you should make them owners. Do you have any advice on structuring ownership incentives for early employees? Right now, we offer small bonuses tied to revenue thresholds, but I just don't think it really creates that true feeling of ownership.
A company focused on consulting for landscaping businesses across Canada and the U.S. That's just so cool. There's so many cool ways to make money. Yeah, look, there's compensation and there's ownership. Compensation is people are going to engage in a certain number of activities in order to increase their compensation. But when you give them ownership, they start, they'll take out the trash from the snack room, or they'll think, oh, this would be a great business opportunity for another division, another part of the company. Whereas compensation, you usually outline what their metrics are, and they will study to that test. But when you make them owners, they're thinking about every aspect of the business and trying to contribute. And I find, give someone some equity, make them an owner, they become like you, and they start thinking about the business even when they're not working. And those are the most important people. I think in a small business, you want to find the critical people and give them chunks of the company. And that's what I've always done. And the mechanics are pretty straightforward. I would do an S Corp for a few reasons. One, I don't know if you've looked at 1202, but look at 1202. If you start a company, sell it 5 years later or more, the equity that you've held for longer than 5 years, if the company has an enterprise value of less than 50 million, which your company does, the first 10 million are tax-free. Actually, they've just increased it to 15 million. The best means of giving people ownership is usually through options on their equity, because then it's not a taxable event. If you give people equity, outright equity, it becomes a taxable event and they have to write a check. When they exercise their options, they will have to write a small check, because you do basically a valuation of 409A that says, all right, the company is worth $2 million. You're giving them options on 2% of the company. That's $40,000. And they're going to have to write a check for that, but they don't have to not until they exercise their options. Now, there's some other stuff. You want to exercise your options ideally a year or more before a liquidity event, because if you own it for longer than a year, you get long-term capital gains. But, individuals can figure that out with their own tax counsel. But essentially, awarding options is the most tax efficient way to give people ownership. And I think that you identify those first 2 or 3 key employees, and that doesn't mean they're first. I was cycled through about 10 or 15 people to get to 2 or 3 key ones. And that's not pretty. But I think in a small business, it's fucking Vietnam. It's hand-to-hand combat. If someone's not adding a lot of value, you got to shed them and bring in someone else. But when you do find someone that's really outstanding, 1, you want to make them an owner. And 2, you want to outline your vision for the company around why that ownership will translate to real economic value. So at Prof G, I think we're going to continue to add voices. We're growing 20 or 30% a year. And by 2027, my guess is one of these traditional media companies or a new media company is going to panic and decide they want to be in the fastest growing ad-supported medium, which is podcasting, and will come in and likely acquire us. Now, none of us are going to get to go anywhere because we'll probably have to sign up for 4 or 5 year employment contracts. But I go through, when we do an all hands, I outline the vision for this company. I have a track record of getting to exits, and then try to say, okay, if this happens, this will be really good for people. And this is why. So the ownership question is important. It can also be phantom ownership through RSUs, or, there's all sorts of ways to give people different types of ownership. But traditionally, it's just an S Corp. And then you give them options. So it's not a taxable event when you award it to them. And they believe that it's real ownership. Also, if you're taking investment, I don't think it's a bad idea to try and do a secondary. What's a secondary? Say you want to raise $2 million and your round is oversubscribed, which is a good problem. Raise 3 and take $1 million and buy people's shares. It's a chance for you to take some money off the table. And also, I do it proportionate. If I sell 10% of my stock to take some money off the table in a financing round, I'll let everyone else sell 10% of their holdings. There's something very powerful about when those options turn into money to really get people's greed glands going. Options structured with a lawyer. You can even do most of it on AI right now that gets people real ownership. And then just as importantly, outline the vision for the company such that they feel they have a piece of something run by someone who understands how to add value and is also looking for an exit, not looking to give it to their kids and there'll never be an exit. Congrats on your success. $1 million in recurring revenue. Just call it AI landscaping or something and go raise billions of dollars to buy chips. Anyways. Best of luck to you. That's all for this episode. If you'd like to submit a question, please email a voice recording to officehours@profgmedia.com. That's officehours@profgmedia.com. Or if you prefer...
happen. And if there's anything we've seen over the past few years after Citizens United, it's that rich people kind of control politics. So if you come up with a plan that that very, very rich people really, really, really hate, and they hate this, my view is they're just not going to let it happen.
So this is total populist bullshit that defines the difference between being right and being effective. The super rich are not paying their fair share. They've registered unparalleled prosperity and haven't paid their fair share. And we need to do something about our deficit and just for the good of the Commonwealth. When the Gini coefficient is where it was during the French Revolution, all right, we've got to do something. 100% right. And then let's go to the part of the program where we try to be effective and not do a non-dom tax where we're going to collect less money in the UK than we did before the non-dom, thinking we were going after billionaires, right? So how do we actually, if the net is to help address income inequality, raise the funds we need to have a social safety net and a military, that's the goal. The goal is to get more money, not less, and then feel good about ourselves. So you brought up the notion of basically property taxes are kind of a wealth tax. I think theoretically, I understand. I own one of 14 units in my building. There are transactions every year, and they can say, all right, your unit is worth approximately X. Ed, what is the value of Prof G Media? Serious question. What's the value? What's the value? No, better. What's the value range?
Shall I answer it seriously? Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think the range of value is for Prof G Media? I would argue one of the reasons people like this show is we give them behind the music. We try to be more transparent than any fucking show. Joe Kiernan isn't going to tell you how overpaid he is. You own a large equity stake in Prof G Media because you believe it's going to be worth something, and owning equity in a company is how you build wealth. It grows tax deferred. The reason I give you ownership in Prof G Media is I want you acting like an owner, and I don't want you to go be Joe Kiernan's successor. So what do you think Prof G Media, give me a range. What is Prof G Media? I can give you within 5 to 8% certainty, with 5 to 8% variance, what I think my condo is worth. What do you think the range of value is for Prof G Media?
I'm going to go with $75 to $100 million. But if David Ellison were the buyer, I'd double it.
Okay. The range is 0. The bottom range is 0. What is this company worth if I show up in the Epstein files tomorrow and I'm arrested? Serious question. What's this company worth?
It's worth, we'll go $5 million.
You think someone would pay $5 million for this company without me?
I'll figure it out. I'll make it happen, Scott.
All right. So let's say 5 million. I buy your high end. If we continue growing, it's the, podcasts are doing well. We have crazy EBITDA margins. We're going 20 to 30% a year. We have done some diversification away from the angry professor. People want to get into the space. It's hot. I get it. I believe the range of this company is somewhere between 0 and 100 million right now. So say they pick the mid-range, 50 million, right? Let's say someone owns 10% of the company, all right? That means they have a $5 million liability. They're saying your asset's worth $5 million. They want 3% of it. Could you come up with $150,000 right now?
No.
Now, to be fair, they're saying for people who make over 50 million, but let's walk through practically Senator Warren's proposal, who, by the way, keeps getting richer and richer as a congressperson, as a senator, who continues to oversee a Senate where taxes go down while she constantly complains about income inequality. Well, do your fucking job. And, you're the referee on the field complaining about the officiating. Anyways, her proposal is a 2% annual tax on wealth over 50 million, 2% annually, 3% on wealth over $1 billion. So let's take it through. So she estimates it would raise $3 trillion over 10 years. That's assuming people don't start piecing out to Madrid or Dubai or turn in the passports and go to Singapore, as one of the founders of Meta did, right? So let's give it to her, $300 billion a year. The 2026 federal budget is $7 trillion. So this radical, administratively complex, constitutionally questionable tax raise is 4% of the budget. And that's before accounting for evasion, avoidance, capital flight, depressed asset values from forced selling, the cost of enforcement. The annual revenue would likely be 30 to 50% lower. You're likely getting 150 to 250 billion a year, less than we currently spend on interest on the debt. And compare that. I'm not one of these don't tax the rich, but here's an idea. get rid of the carried interest loophole on investment firms, and get rid of the lower capital gains tax. Everyone pays 37%, not 21. By the way, do those two things, you raise the amount every year that she claims this highly speculative, dangerous, weird wealth tax would. There's no reason I should be paying 21% when I sell my stocks, and you're paying 37% when you make money. There's no reason that the private equity billionaires should be paying long-term capital gains on their carried interest, which is essentially a commission, whereas if you sell a copier as a salesperson, you pay current income. But when I get a commission on buying and selling assets, I pay long-term capital gains even though I haven't put any capital at risk. There are much more pragmatic, enforceable, acceptable means of raising taxes on wealthy people.
Totally agree with that. I think the thing that the tax solution I think is best is the borrowing tax. As you pointed out, like, why don't billionaires pay taxes? It's because they just never sell their assets. And then it's like, well, how do they come up with the money? It's because they borrow against their assets. And if you do that,
triggers a taxable event.
Exactly. So if you make that a taxable event, then you're solving the problem right there. But I think, just to play devil's advocate on this wealth tax thing, I think the way a lot of people probably see it is, you're presenting an alternative. You're like, this doesn't work, but how about we do this?
No, but the billionaires are just like, this is a bad idea.
This is a bad idea. It doesn't work. It's too complicated. How are you even going to figure it out? I own this company. And when they do that more and more times, at a certain point, it starts to sound like, okay, you guys are just making up a bunch of fucking excuses because you don't want to pay taxes. If you do this, we're all going to leave. So you can't do it. It's like, okay, well, propose another solution. Because the inequality in this country, everyone agrees at this point, has gotten out of control.
Let me give you another one that I think is a better way to taxation. Zuckerberg is threatening to leave, right? I think he will leave.
Yeah, he bought the house.
I don't know. I think he's got between 80 and 120 billion, let's call it $100 billion in Meta stock. He probably realizes it's been an amazing run. It's pretty high. Maybe it's time to start liquidating, and he's going to come up with a bull. I've had it. I'm out of here. I don't like the homeless encampments. I can't stand it. He'll come up with a bunch of Keith Raboy bullshit reasons for why he just wants to pay lower taxes. Here's the bottom line. Mark Zuckerberg has enormously benefited from the University of California, the great Cal State system, our highways, the fact that we have massive investments in social programs that make it a really nice place to live. For all the shit posting, the wealthiest people in the world, which is Latin for the people with the most options, all decide to stay in California. And it's because there's enormous investments in the infrastructure paid for by California citizens. So if Mark Zuckerberg aggregates $100 billion in wealth while in California, he can piece out to Florida, but when he sells his stock, he is subject to state taxes on the amount of money accreted while he was living in and leveraging and enjoying the California infrastructure. So when Bezos moved from Washington State to Florida, and this is my favorite, to spend more time with his father, what a guy. What a guy. When he starts selling down his stock, which he did immediately after getting to, I guess his dad talked him into selling his stock, because the moment he moved to spend more time with his dad, he started selling stock. Okay. When you leave, they go, Zuck, here's a mark, 100 billion in wealth. Until you have paid 14% on that 100 billion, maybe adjust it if the stock goes down in value. But if it goes to 200 billion, fine, pay the 0% in Florida on that 100 billion. But on that first 100 billion you're selling that you accreted in California as a function of the amazing culture and infrastructure of California, an amazing human capital that is drawn to California such that they can go eat sushi at Nobu in Malibu and go sailing in the bay and go see, the Rams play. I'm trying to come up with cultural references for just how fucking awesome, or go to the Greek theater, or go to stay at the pool at the Beverly Hills Hotel. All the amazing things that are singular about California, you are paying for what you accrued here. There are a lot of common sense taxes that are it's indefensible to argue against them. Indefensible. If you made all this fucking money in California and then want to peace out and not pay back California, no. You are paying California taxes on the money you made and the wealth you accrued in California. Get rid of the carried interest loophole. Do away with the reduced taxes on capital gains, and your state taxes follow you on the capital and wealth you have accreted while enjoying the privilege and investments of that state. Boom.
And make borrowing a taxable event.
There you go.
There's our four.
That's right. Triggers a taxable event.
Exactly. Just the final point, and then we'll move on. It is just so frustrating when you've got this rampant inequality where 19 households control 2% of all the household wealth in America. We all know the stats. The top 1% commands a third of the nation's wealth. Never been higher. Inequality going out of control. None of these rich people who appear to care about or say that they care about the state and the health of the nation, no one says a word. And then the wealth tax is proposed, and suddenly they're all triggered and they're all up in arms about how this doesn't make sense. And suddenly they have this great analytical minds about, what is best for America, what makes sense in terms of the tax code, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, it is so obvious how self-interested you are with your motives here. And I think what they need to get through their heads is that this train isn't stopping. I mean, billionaires have never been as unpopular in America as they are today. I mean, the statistics are just striking. 7 in 10 think Americans think billionaires need to be taxed more. More than half think billionaires are threatening democracy. People do not like billionaires. And you can say that that's unreasonable or they're being jealous or whatever it is. But that is the reality of the situation. And it's a function of how out of control inequality has gotten. So this argument of that doesn't make sense, we're going to leave, it doesn't really work. Like, I think you'd have to take a poll of the people of California who would probably say, okay, leave. We don't care. From our view, you're not really paying taxes anyway. We don't really like you. Get out of here, fine with us. And, maybe that will be a mistake later down the line, but that's the reality on the ground right now.
It is reality and it is a mistake. That was the sentiment here in the UK, was people like, fuck you, leave. And they did. And now they're going to collect less money.
And maybe it will be a mistake. And to be fair, I'm not a huge fan of this wealth tax compared to others. But I think the billionaires should be, if they want to take this seriously, propose alternatives. Don't just sit there and say, no, it doesn't make sense, and then peace out. I mean, give a real solution.
The billionaires themselves will never do that. The billionaires will never come up with that. I mean, I saw a clip of basically what is the right-wing version of this podcast. And it has a couple billionaires, and they said, you can't get the taxes we need unless you go after the middle class. That's where all the revenue is. I'm like, okay, let me get this.
They said that?
You guys are suggesting the pragmatic solution is to raise taxes on middle-class households?
They're going to lose. I mean, they're so out of touch.
The Epstein overlay, look at it. The president, the wealthiest man in the world, and the guy who's considered the kind of prototypical icon of billionaire wealth and technology, Bill Gates, they're all in the Epstein files, dozens, if not hundreds of times. That is not helping their case. Let me get this.
Totally.
Income inequality is out of control. And now I believe, unfairly, every billionaire, I think there's a decent size of the population right now, a decent segment of the population right now that feels as if the majority of billionaires are pedophiles.
Yeah.
I mean, tax them? Yeah, I'm down with that. Whatever it is.
Over its real world costs, from energy demand and infrastructure strain to concerns about jobs and economic disruption. And that concern isn't coming from just one side of the aisle. Politicians across the spectrum, from Ron DeSantis to Bernie Sanders, have started sounding alarms about the industry's impact. So, Scott, I think this is the defining issue for the next 10 years. I think this will make or break careers. I think it's already breaking careers. The question of AI, do we want it? How do we want to handle it? How do we want to regulate it? It seemed like it was sort of a technological nerd bro conversation. It is now very quickly becoming a mainstream conversation. It is spurring all of these grassroots organizations across the country, people who are protesting against data center constructions. It's becoming a really big deal. in Washington and basically across America. So a lot to say there. I guess I'll just start with what are your initial reactions to the notion that AI is now the new political football?
It's easy to, to highlight the problems or the causes and not necessarily the solution. But the way I see it is all you have is a bunch of quote unquote very smart people. There's two things going on here. The chocolate and peanut butter of the just general distaste of AI from the American public is a function of two things. One, I'm really sick of hearing all these quote unquote founders of AI who the moment they vest their 100 or 200 or $300 million in shares and sell them on a secondary market, all of a sudden get very concerned about AI. Bitch, that's not helpful now. You built this fucking code.
What have I done?
While you were creating your wealth, you didn't say anything. And now that you've decided, okay, I got my 3% of Anthropic, that's worth $10 billion. I'm going to go write fucking poetry. Well, fuck you. And all they talk about is the massive peril. Well, what do you mean exactly? And use all that. You coded this peril. Any thoughts on how we uncode it, bitch? And by the way, are you so worried about the peril that you're going to give your money back or realize that you have created such an existential threat you're not entitled to the options? Or are you just going to catastrophize and scare the shit out of us while you're writing poetry from the Côte d'Azur with your fucking Belarusian whores? Yeah, that's really helpful. You're a great citizen. Thanks so much. And then the second thing is on a pragmatic level, you have millions of households who've seen their electricity rates go up 67% because there's some fucking empty building that supposedly has, computers and chips, this data center down the road that's not employing anybody, that's sucking all the energy off the grid. And all I see is my bill, my electric bill's gone from $80 a month to $140. So there needs to be legislation. One legislation is pretty simple. We need to start taxing the shit out of data centers.
Yes.
At least tax them to the incremental cost of the incremental energy and the incremental price increases. Middle-class households shouldn't be subsidizing AI companies right now. So, but I am really fed up with the post I've made my money catastrophizing, and I don't buy it. I don't see any reason why AI can't be used as much for defensive as offensive measures. And maybe I might be missing it here. There's people much smarter than me claiming it's really dangerous. Fine. But what do we do? Fine. You built it. Fine. What do we do? Come up with some solutions. I don't want to hear the word peril. I want to hear the word solution. And two, let's figure out a way that all this wealth creation, not only at a minimum, if it's not going to make the economic lives of the middle class easier, at a minimum, it can't raise their prices.
I also think that Wall Street is kind of underestimating the impact on future revenues here, specifically the political backlash against AI. You got big tech spending $660 billion on AI, 3,000 data center projects underway across America. Everyone's so excited about what AI is going to do, and they're figuring out, okay, how are we going to set up the chips, and how are we going to set up the energy, and how is it all going to work out, and who are going to be the winners, who are going to be the losers, etc. But I do think that Wall Street is neglecting a very large question, and I wrote about this last week, which is how many people actually want this stuff? Is it possible that the American people have decided, in similar to our previous conversation on a wealth tax, in the same way that Americans decided we really hate billionaires, what is that going to do to the structure of our economy if most Americans hate them? What happens if most Americans hate AI? What happens if most Americans decide, actually, you know what? We don't like these data centers that employ the third of the number of people that work at an average Walmart and also send our electric bills through the roof, which is something we have already seen. It's been well documented. And also most analysts and most economists agree this is only going to continue with more AI, more energy usage. Also, it happens with your utility bills as well, because these data centers consume millions of gallons of water per day. So if all of this happens and all of this builds up, And I get that it's kind of more of a popular politics conversation, and one might argue that's separate from markets. But I would argue, actually, no, these two things are very, very linked, because we're already seeing all these activist groups shutting down data centers, saying you're not allowed to build this on our property. There's a town in Wisconsin, they want to recall their mayor because he allowed an OpenAI data center to get built. So if that happens on a mass scale, what does that do to the future cash flows of a Google or an OpenAI or an Anthropic or any of these other companies that are building data centers? Does that hurt your top line? I would argue definitely. And I think the question is, how big an issue is this going to become in the political realm? And what I'm seeing, and we talked about this months ago, we said this is probably going to become an issue. What I've seen over the past basically 2 weeks is that this is rapidly accelerating into like the biggest issue in America right now. Every politician is figuring it out, talking about it. And now it's on every politician, every elected official to decide, what is my stance on AI? Do I like it? Do I support it? Or do I not? And I think increasingly, as it gets less popular, you're going to see a lot more politicians saying, I don't like AI, I'm going to be against it. I don't know if that's the right position. It might be the wrong position, but I do think that is going to be a position that becomes more popular.
Again, I think it all stems back from, to a certain extent, Epstein and the war on, I won't call it the billionaire class, but the Epstein class, because essentially AI has become inextricably linked, whether it's Musk or Trump's support of it or Sam Altman and
Totally.
Prostrating himself to Trump. AI has become kind of the business of billionaires and tech and everything that's bad about it. And also with the internet, you got to at least reserve your plane ticket or something. I think those of us who are what I'd call AI literate are getting a lot of value from it. But I would argue that GLP-1 is actually having a more positive impact emotionally on more Americans than AI right now. I think people are experimenting with AI, but I don't think people think, wake up, or a lot of people don't go, God, I just love ChatGPT. It's so much fun. Or I'm getting so much utility. I think people are blown away by it. And there's a lot of people in business going, this is hugely important. But the catastrophizing far outweighs the perceived utility at this point. Whereas with the internet, no one was catastrophizing about it. The narrative here has gotten away from them, and that is the everyday consumer sees nothing but higher electric prices and some supposedly very brainiac person saying it's the end of the world. It's like, well, okay, I'm done with this bullshit. And if this doesn't pan out for Sam Altman's $850 billion raise, that I'm okay with that. And a lot of these folks don't see how this is going to affect them economically. There's a small number, you've pointed this out, there's a small number of companies where you have exposure to AI. And so I don't think